Do you think the Nancy Guthrie case, if they end up getting a good profile, could be the case where, for the first time, these companies are forced to let law enforcement in?
Some future high-stakes inquiry will possess a clear biological signature and a refined profile, yet remain unmatched in federal databases, necessitating a swift intervention to prevent further bloodshed, much like the urgency seen with Brian Kohberger. It stands to reason that his victim count would have climbed significantly without the rapid application of genetic genealogy to pinpoint his identity. The outcome feels inevitable now. We are simply waiting for the right set of circumstances to trigger the shift. Consider, for a moment, the potential fallout from a high-stakes event like the Charlie Kirk incident, or even the attempt on Donald Trump's life, had the suspects not been neutralized or caught immediately. Authorities won't think twice about breaching those private silos if the investigation stalls in a matter of supreme national interest, especially in cases of such high visibility where the perceived need for an exception overrides standard privacy protocols. A heavy silence had descended over the inquiry for weeks. No breakthroughs, no cuffs, just a chilling realization that the culprit might have vanished. Yet one journalist returned to the site, driven by something far more profound than the hunger for a news cycle or a simple briefing. A nagging inconsistency pulled him back to that street, where he stood before the residents, meticulously deconstructing the narrative established by the police. However, his gaze shifted toward an overlooked dimension of the scene, a minute detail that had escaped common scrutiny. Then, the perspective shifted entirely. This wasn't a formal admission of guilt, but a nuance that reframed the entire picture. Gaping holes remain in the official story, fractured segments of the chronology and maneuvers that defy logical explanation, coupled with a chillingly methodical demeanor. Upon closer inspection, the theory of a random act of violence began to crumble. The act appeared surgically precise, deeply intentional, and perhaps fueled by a direct connection. The truly disturbing revelation, however, lies beyond the what. It forces us to confront a far more haunting question. Who was the hunter, and who was the prey? Demanding clarity, he has been scrutinizing the minutiae that fell through the cracks of the investigation. He now suspects a crucial element remains buried, a potential oversight that could dismantle the current theory. Even the most meticulously crafted schemes are prone to failure, as perfection is a ghost. There is inevitably a singular lapse, a fracture in the design, an unintended signature left in the wake of the crime. That critical error may have already surfaced. If his instincts prove correct, the predator's perceived invisibility is nothing more than a fragile illusion. In their hubris, they may have discarded a piece of themselves or exposed a vulnerability they thought was hidden. That solitary thread could unravel the entire mystery. His return to the crime scene wasn't a search for the glaringly obvious. He sought the kind of truth that evades grand headlines or the formal theater of a police press conference. Instead, he searched for a subtle dissonance, because in these shadows the truth rarely resides in plain sight. It lingers in the peripheral feeling of wrongness. On that same pavement, he chose a path of deliberate observation. By rejecting the hurried summaries and filtered reports of others, he allowed the environment to speak for itself. Tracing each physical step in every passing 60 seconds, he attempted to reconstruct the raw mechanics of the event. Almost immediately, the narrative began to fracture. The chronology was far more jagged than the public had been led to believe. In the sterile environment of an official report, the sequence appeared orderly, a series of timed movements and estimated windows. But standing in the cold dark of that reality, imagining a figure maneuvering through those shadows, a new skepticism takes hold. Consider the logistics. The time required to breach the perimeter, neutralize a security system, and dominate the environment, all while remaining a ghost. Real-world violence doesn't follow a polished script. It is plagued by hesitation and friction. Chaos is the norm, yet this event unfolded with an unsettling fluidity. That eerie absence of friction became his primary focus. This wasn't the frantic energy of an impulsive act. It was a display of absolute dominance. The perpetrator did not merely react. They operated with a chilling economy of motion, possessing an intimate knowledge of the geography and the timing. A darker hypothesis emerges. This may not have been their first time crossing that threshold. Familiarity erases the margin of error. An outsider relies on luck, but a predator operates on certainty. His analysis shifted to the preceding days, recognizing that a premeditated strike doesn't begin at 2:30 in the morning. The countdown likely began weeks earlier, and that is where the mask starts to slip. Faint indications suggest a predator was lurking. This wasn't a blatant intrusion, but rather a patient, surgical surveillance designed to remain undetected. Consider the logistics. Navigating that terrain so fluidly required a deep, intimate understanding of the physical environment. It demands mastery of local rhythms, the guard shifts, the camera angles, and those specific windows when the world falls silent. Such profound spatial intelligence isn't accidental. It is the direct result of methodical, long-term monitoring. Brian Entin suggests this stalking may have persisted for days or even weeks. However, the most unsettling detail is actually far deeper. If a watcher was present, then there is a strong probability they left their own digital ghost behind. Perhaps they weren't caught in high definition, but rather as a recurring flicker, a vehicle circling the block too many times, a recurring silhouette appearing in the background, a presence that didn't quite fit the scenery, yet never caused a scene. These are the intangible nuances that vanish from official reports, but continue to haunt the minds of investigators. This exact brand of psychological detail is precisely what Brian Entin is known for, relentlessly pursuing. While typical detectives hunt for physical clues, Entin deciphers behavior and the cold human patterns behind the violence. When viewed through that lens, the entire scene begins to feel like a meticulously choreographed performance. It wasn't staged to be fake, but staged in its clinical execution, a controlled effort to eliminate every conceivable variable. The paradox of control is that it relies on total precision, and precision leaves absolutely no safety net for error. Any deviation from perfection becomes a glaring anomaly. This is where Entin believes the facade may have finally cracked. Within that chronological record, there's a moment defying logic, a movement or silence that shouldn't exist. It seems microscopic, nearly invisible to the naked eye. Yet, in high-stakes cases, it is often the smallest flaw that brings the entire structure crashing down. A single lapse in judgment is all it takes for the carefully built lie to start bleeding the truth. Current evidence suggests that specific moment is already there, nestled within the chronology, waiting for discovery. The question remains, did investigators simply miss it, or are they holding their cards close? Because if Brian Entin is correct, this crime was never as clean as it appeared. The veneer of perfection only held because no one had analyzed it as a chain of conscious choices rather than just events. When you begin questioning the motive behind those specific actions, a much darker reality starts to take shape. Seeing intention, not mere randomness. And intent is heavy, it leaves a footprint, no matter how deeply it is buried or how much time passes. Consequently, the individual responsible may have already revealed far more than they ever intended to show. They didn't count on Brian Entin dismantling their narrative from a completely different psychological angle. When the focus shifts from what to the mechanics of how, the entire narrative transforms. That is precisely where this investigation is venturing next. If the chronological foundation is flawed, then every conclusion built upon it is equally compromised. The definitive account of that night has yet to be told. As Brian Entin delved into the digital abyss, he pivoted away from human testimony to focus on something far more objective and unforgiving. The cameras. Not just the obvious lenses, but every single electronic eye that could have captured a shadow that night. Smart doorbells, urban monitoring grids, neighbor security feeds, and even traffic sensors miles away. Today, moving through the world unseen is a near impossibility. Yet, the perpetrator clearly harbored the arrogant belief that they could dictate what was recorded. That hubris alone reveals a significant profile. It suggests a chilling confidence, not the frantic energy of an amateur, but the calculated poise of a predator. Approaching a dark residence with the specific intent of neutralizing a security lens requires a high level of strategy. That is exactly what the digital record eventually surrendered. A shadow appeared steady, unhurried, and frighteningly efficient. The moment they entered the frame, there was no hesitation, no nervous scanning of the surroundings, and zero signs of typical adrenaline-fueled panic. Just a direct, purposeful stride toward the lens to terminate the feed. At a glance, this appears to be a brilliant tactical maneuver. Blind the camera, erase the proof. But that logic is fundamentally flawed in the modern world. The very act of disabling the device is a recorded confession. This is where the case takes a compelling turn. Instead of concealing the suspect, That single act of sabotage may have provided the very signature they sought to bury. Drawing from the observations shared by Brian Entin, the manner in which the subject engaged with the lens is just as haunting as their physical arrival. Consider this. The individual made no effort to evade the electronic eye. Rather than skirting the periphery, they stepped squarely into the frame, revealing a chilling psychological disregard for being witnessed. This behavior suggests a profound indifference to detection, or perhaps a misplaced faith in a disguise they believed was impenetrable. Reflect on that logic for a moment. To maintain true anonymity, one typically retreats. Usually, they linger in shadows, keeping their distance. But this individual breached that void, suggesting one of two chilling possibilities. They were either certain their identity was untraceable, or they fundamentally misunderstood the mechanics of the surveillance system. That second scenario is where the mystery deepens, as even a minor technical misjudgment can create a fatal blind spot or error. It is precisely these human errors that investigators and journalists like Entin hunt for. Evaluate the specific timing. The subject emerges, nears the lens, tries to compromise the device, and then vanishes. Yet, a complication remains. A gap in the timeline following that moment persists, because disabling a camera does not erase the history already captured. Sabotage only blinds the future. We must ask, what was recorded in those crucial moments leading up to the attempt? Furthermore, what seemingly minor details were overlooked then that have now taken on a terrifying new importance? Standard forensic reviews usually fixate on the obvious, the subject, the crime, and the most dramatic frame of footage. Often, the key lies on the periphery, a passing headlight, a distorted reflection, or a movement that contradicts the established timeline. These subtle nuances don't immediately grab attention, but under intense scrutiny, they begin to tell a darker story. This specific psychological angle is exactly what Brian Entin is renowned for investigating. He looks past the central image, dissecting the environmental context surrounding the event. Every single frame serves as a frozen slice of truth, and the truth is rarely as simple as it seems. Regarding surveillance coverage, a single lens is never enough. In residential zones with multiple properties, overlapping views are common, meaning even if one device is compromised, a secondary eye might still be watching. Here, the investigation broadens. If the perpetrator believed they had successfully blinded the main camera, their guard likely dropped. They likely moved with less caution, choosing exposed paths or lingering in the area far longer than anticipated. This allows another hidden lens to document something. Not a clear face, but a gait, a trajectory, or a timestamp shards that, when assembled, form a larger mosaic. Current findings suggest the existence of more footage than first realized recordings that have not yet been released to the public. While unconfirmed in detail, it hints that the suspect's path was never as concealed as they arrogantly believed. This is where the investigative pressure begins to mount. If multiple cameras caught fragments of that night, those shards can be synchronized frame by frame until a trail is revealed. Where they originated, where they fled, their duration on site, and most critically, whether they ever returned to the scene. One haunting question remains: was this a singular event, or part of a much more repetitive, calculated pattern? If the subject had scouted the area previously, there is a high probability they were caught on camera then, too. They might have appeared harmless, just another figure blending in. But repetition betrays them, a car seen multiple times, a silhouette appearing on various nights, a route through the neighborhood that becomes a recognizable habit. Such habits aren't alarming initially, but post-crime, they become critical. If Entin's intuition is right, this transcends a single night. It may involve a chain of events preceding that night, moments recorded and stored, yet ignored until this very second. Reviewing the footage through a new lens shifts the focus from what happened to the steps that led there. That shift in focus makes the situation dangerous for the person responsible. Essentially, it proves their actions weren't invisible. Every stride and decision may exist in digital storage, simply waiting to be connected. Once those connections are established, the story evolves from a vague mystery into a definitive, directional path forward. If that path terminates at an individual, the question is no longer if, but when. Yet, one problem remains. Despite the visuals and the leads, a vital piece is still missing: the specific detail that binds this entire case together. Evidence alone is insufficient. It requires context, and that crucial context may not be found within any camera's frame. The truth likely stems from something chillingly human, a deliberate choice, a hidden grievance, or a deep-seated connection that finally clarifies the motive. Diane, as these revelations come to light, it seems the resolution is looming much closer than anyone could have anticipated. If the perpetrator stepped into the light and their trajectory was documented, there is a lingering possibility that someone, somewhere, recognized a familiar shadow. This marks the precise moment the inquiry pivots from the cold lens of surveillance to the complexities of human witness, because cameras merely record motion. Yet, only the human mind can decode the psychological weight behind those movements. Should a witness be harboring an unspoken truth, the ultimate revelation won't stem from high-tech forensics, but from the shattering of a long-held, heavy silence. The moment Brian Entin diverted his attention from the endless loop of grainy surveillance frames, he revisited the ground already covered by investigators, yet through a far more intimate lens, choosing direct human interaction over sterile paperwork. In any criminal inquiry, a haunting void exists between the rigidity of what is recorded and the fluid, often fractured nature of human memory. It is within that very shadow that the truth frequently conceals itself, leading him to pose an elementary, yet vital inquiry. Who was actually present under the cover of night? Not just names on a formal roster, but souls physically occupying that space while the world slept. Individuals who perhaps glimpsed a flicker of movement or noted a subtle anomaly without grasping its dark significance in that fleeting moment. This is where the narrative blurs, for the mind lacks the precision of a lens. It decays, warps, and is poisoned by dread and the passage of time. Despite these mental fractures, a rhythm began to emerge from the chaos, starting with a neighbor's recollection of a specific vehicle. The description was hazy and unconfirmed, yet it carried enough weight to imply the car was a stranger idling briefly before vanishing into the dark. It appeared once, perhaps twice, barely registering as a threat, while another resident recalled a suspicious flicker of activity near the curb. It wasn't a clear visual, but rather a visceral sensation of wrongness, an unsettling presence that sparked a chill before dissolving into nothingness. These are the fragments of testimony that seldom grace the front pages, often dismissed as too tenuous or lacking the punch of a smoking gun. They offer no names and provide no certainty, yet Brian Entin recognized a profound and dangerous undercurrent within these whispers. In a mystery of this scale, ambiguity is a data point. When a chorus of voices reports a shared unease within a specific window, coincidence dies. It transforms into a collective, psychological architecture of perception. Perception is vital, as predators do not exist outside their surroundings. They inhabit them, their every move dictated by the cold calculus of exposure. Each choice is tethered to the fear of being seen, and as Entin deepened his interviews, a singular, chilling theory began to take root. A figure might have haunted the perimeter for much longer than the timeline suggests, eschewing a frantic or rushed entry. Instead, they existed within the environment, absorbing its rhythms and studying its vulnerabilities, a realization that fundamentally shifts the stakes. An outsider would have acted with frantic speed to minimize their high-risk window, but if the killer possessed local knowledge, the psychology changes entirely. Movements become surgical, the timing turns clinical, and a dangerous level of comfort sets in. And in that very comfort, the seeds of a fatal error are often sown. Amid the disjointed stories, one specific detail began to pulse. Its power lay not in spectacle, but in its persistence, a recurring premonition that the atmosphere had soured long before the violence erupted. This timing is critical. An off feeling beforehand implies a physical presence, and presence is the undeniable fingerprint of preparation. This is the crux of Entin's methodology. He views these testimonies not as final answers, but as raw, psychological signals. He hears them as frequencies from an underground narrative elements that the sanitized, official timeline failed to detect. As he meticulously aligned these disparate signals, a deeply unsettling hypothesis began to crystallize. Suppose the intruder wasn't a ghost passing through, but a student of the silence, documenting the routines and the moments when awareness was at its lowest. For a crime to appear seamless on the surface, it often requires the foundation of a repetitive, cold rehearsal. Prolonged surveillance and ritualistic patterns always leave a trace, a psychological residue that lingers even if it goes unnoticed initially. The inquiry now takes a nuanced detour. Once you entertain the idea of a watchful eye, The questions evolve from what occurred to something far more sinister. Who already knew exactly how that night would unfold? This transition is paramount, as it reframes a chaotic event into a structured performance, and structure is the undeniable proof of intent. Yet, establishing a motive doesn't close the book. It only pulls us deeper into the labyrinthine shadows of the mystery. Even with the evidence of a watcher, a planner, or a familiar face, one jagged piece of the puzzle remains missing. Why? That single word remains unanswered, devoid of a verified motive, a named suspect, or a narrative that finally stitches the wounds together. We are left with nothing but fragments. And fragments are volatile. They breed speculation and feed the darkest parts of the imagination. Theories range from a surgically targeted strike to a moment of horrific, random opportunity. Others suspect that the most damning evidence remains locked away from the public eye. But for now, every theory remains a ghost. Brian Entin treads cautiously, refusing to substitute hard facts with mere conjecture. Instead, he focuses the lens on the glaring absences within the narrative. In this specific puzzle, the voids carry as much weight as the established facts, primarily because the motive for targeting this particular individual remains a total enigma. No tangible associations have surfaced publicly, and any verifiable history remains entirely undocumented at this stage. Without a confirmed motive, a psychological hollow has formed a dangerous silence that demands a logical explanation. In the world of high-stakes forensics, these vacuums are quickly consumed by speculation and paranoia, yet Entin resists the urge to provide premature answers. His intuition draws him back to a singular, haunting premise, that the public record is far from complete. This involves someone lurking in the periphery of the timeline, not necessarily a culprit, but perhaps a silent observer whose reticence grows with every inquiry. It isn't a direct refusal to speak, but a calculated pause, and in a criminal investigation, that hesitation acts as a simmering form of psychological pressure. Such pauses are born from uncertainty, rooted in deep-seated terror, or triggered by the suffocating sensation of being watched. That last prospect alters the entire atmosphere of the inquiry, suggesting that the crime's shadow has darkened the entire neighborhood, not just the victim's life. It is a quiet, creeping contagion that moves through the community without a sound. This pervasive dread creates a chasm between a witness's memory and their testimony, making the truth an increasingly elusive target. As Entin delves deeper into his documentation, he recognizes a chillingly familiar architecture emerging from the fog of the investigation. It is the kind of quietude that stems not from ignorance, but from a terrifying, unspoken understanding among those close to the events. This realization is profoundly disturbing, as it points toward a collective awareness that remains hidden. Knowledge is being shared in private, yet withheld from the public, leaving the forensic picture intentionally fragmented and incomplete. Despite the outward standstill, the gears of the investigation continue to grind beneath the surface. Away from the flashbulbs of press conferences, detectives are quietly cross-referencing minor details and securing back-channel confirmations. Unseen developments are being scrutinized with fresh eyes, a phase of reporting that typically signals a significant shift in the investigative winds. It suggests a fresh discovery has been made, one too volatile or complex to be shared with the public just yet. If the scene was truly under surveillance and the timing was as precise as it appears, the inquiry has pivoted toward a much darker psychological query. The focus is no longer just on who was present, but on who possessed the unique capability to vanish into the scenery unnoticed. This line of reasoning leads us into Chapter 4, where the investigation strips away the noise of casual witnesses. We move past the grainy surveillance feeds and the scattered anecdotes of bystanders. The focus narrows onto the calculated skeleton of the plot itself, revealing insights that may be the most honest evidence found so far. By the time Entin reached the final phase of his investigative journey, the perspective shifted. The case ceased to be a chaotic pile of clues and began to take the shape of a deliberate, engineered structure. Every timestamp and verified piece of data suggests a narrative built on design rather than luck or random chance. Each camera angle and witness statement started to lock into place with a chilling, controlled precision. This level of discipline is the hallmark of a professional operation, yet even the most rigorous plans harbor a fatal flaw. Eventually, the cold logic of the plan must collide with the messy, unpredictable nature of the physical world. Entin turned his scrutiny toward that specific point of friction. If the preparation was flawless, then the only vulnerability lies in the moment the theory had to be put into practice. Currently, the authorities have withheld any news of a breakthrough, and no formal arrests have been made. No name has been officially linked to the crime, yet the underlying energy of the case has fundamentally transformed. Certain puzzle pieces that once seemed to fit perfectly are now being viewed with a renewed sense of skepticism. In the high-stakes world of criminal profiling, this usually indicates that a more complex theory has taken hold. This isn't about discarding old evidence. It is about viewing it through a more dangerous and revealing lens. A slight lag in the sequence, an unnatural movement or a minute gap in the expected chronology, small errors that, when combined, become catastrophic. These are the structural stress points that eventually cause the entire fabrication to collapse under its own weight. Entin's analysis leans into these discrepancies, highlighting the illogical gaps rather than the obvious facts. In a perfect execution, the timeline remains seamless, but here, the jagged edges between the known points speak volumes. A natural flow is expected, where every action leads logically to the next. Instead, we find unexplained pauses and murky transitions that suggest a much more disturbing truth is waiting in the shadows. It is not that the mystery is unsolvable, but that the perspective is incomplete and a shift in view changes everything. Once a hidden path is exposed, actions can be mapped. From those actions, we can begin to dissect the psychology of intent. When intent is finally laid bare, the person behind the mask finds it much harder to remain in the shadows. Yet, we still lack a formal name for that identity. For now, we only have a trajectory. That trajectory leads toward a chilling realization. The perpetrator likely overlooked how many of their movements were being indirectly archived. Not by a solitary witness or camera, but by the very architecture of the environment itself. The modern landscape remembers what the human mind forgets through a grid of sensors, digital systems, and predictable routines. When synchronized, these elements form a quiet, indelible ledger of every motion, one that is immune to the erosion of time. If the persistent work of Brian Entin is accurate, the smoking gun may already be hidden within that digital silence. The mosaic simply hasn't been finished. The case sits in a state of tension, neither closed nor concluded, but drifting toward a forced truth. Because in every investigation of this nature, there comes a point where fractured details cease to be noise and start to form a silhouette. At that threshold, doubt is replaced by the irreversible weight of knowing. But until that clock strikes, the matter remains suspended, a complex pattern gradually sharpening its focus, a truth that is not yet ready to step fully into the light.